Well, Kenya has historically had some of the most expensive elections, not just in the region, but in the world. If you compare our elections with places like Rwanda, for example, where per voter they spend about $1, Kenya in comparison is spending about 25 dollars per voter to deliver these elections. So they're quite expensive, and it's been a trend. If you look at the 2013 election, it was similarly expensive, probably about $20 per voter. So and one thing to understand about the Kenyan elections is actually 6 elections in one. So people will actually be sitting to select both the president, members of parliament, governors, members of county assemblies, women representatives. It's quite a wide array of candidates they're going to be voting for.
So for all the things that come with the Kenyan election, as you mentioned, coming with multiple candidates, does that still make it proportionate, though, to the amount that's being spent?
Well, a lot of the money is actually goes to the Electoral Commission, but we've got to understand Kenya has a big problem with corruption, so lots of it ends up being stolen or being diverted into areas that it shouldn't be. Further, also, there is quite a big trust deficit in Kenya, so that we spend proportionally quite a lot in trying to simply ensure that the opportunities for mischief, for rigging the election, for stealing the vote, for stuffing ballots, for reporting unreal results. We've actually eliminated lots of the opportunities for that, and that costs a lot.
So in terms of the funding, how much of that is private versus public?
Well, most of the funding, pretty much all the funding that goes into the election is public funding. There's also quite a lot that's donated in by our development partners, by governments such as in the US and the UK, and they do give quite a lot. So there's not much in terms of private spending on the election itself, at least in terms of delivering it. But when it comes to running campaigns, there's lots and lots of money that goes in from private candidates. They spend up to about $50 million for presidential campaign, is just quite a lot by our standards.
Now let's look at the actual views of everyday Kenyans who are looking at all this huge amount of money going into this election. What do they think of it? Sometimes in the US, people tend to really despise the amount that goes into these huge campaigns. What do Kenyans think about this spending?
Well, for Kenyans, you've got to understand our system really does not encourage participation in the 5 years in between elections. And people are pretty much shut out from having a say in how government contracts are awarded, in holding public officials to account. So this also becomes a chance for them during elections to sort of get a little bit of return in the investment they put into public officials, because they don't expect they'll get anything after 5 years. For the next 5 years. So I think for most Kenyans, this is their turn to eat, as we say it here. And we know that once the politicians get into power, it will be their turn to eat.
Now, if we look at how some of the money is being broken down, I have to mention safety. We know that the chief in charge of overseeing the polls was tragically found, tortured and killed. How much of the resources are going towards things like safety and ensuring that this is a fair and peaceful election?
A huge amount of the money that you mentioned does go to security of our budget, but it's not necessarily to protect public officials, because Chris Sando, who is a public official you mentioned, was quite a senior person in the Independent Elections and Boundaries Commission, which is the body that is charged with running our elections, and he did not have any police protection. That said, there is quite a lot of recruitment, for example, of police officers to man polling stations, to provide security across the country for this. And I think they're recruiting up to 100,000 police officers just for the election. Another thing to remember is that our government has to plan at least for the possibility of election violence or unrest after the election, in case the election is disputed, as pretty much all our elections have been. And also it includes as well mobilizing elements of the Kenya Defense Forces, which is meant to protect against external threats to the elections. We've had threats from the Al-Shabaab, which is the Somali-based terrorist militia on our borders, and who've been responsible for quite a number of attacks over the last 4 or 5 years here in Kenya. So there is a huge security operation going on, and that is taking up a big chunk of the budget for the security, for the election.